Good morning, and good evening. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our session on drug repurposing. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks to our guest, Dr. Marco Schito, Dr. Pantziarka, and to my brilliant co-chair, Dr. Denise Reinke. My name is Ornella Gonzato. I'm the founder and president of the Italian leading patient advocacy organization that deals with every type of sarcoma except GIST, as well as a long-standing and currently an appointed member of the board of SPAEN. Let me briefly introduce this session. I'll try to share my screen. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. First of all, why such a topic? And mostly, why should the patients and patient advocates be interested in it? At the first glance, although repurposing is one of the priority topics of the policy agenda, both in Europe and USA for the upcoming years, it may seem far from the sphere of a direct patient interest and involvement. However, the reality of the situation is different. Increasing awareness of the potential role of patient advocates in repurposing is in fact one of the main goals of this session, a session that consists of 4 presentations, starting with an overview and background on the topic with its challenges and opportunities, and then moving on the value of repurposing in oncology, as well as the value of global collaborations and engagement of patients in such initiatives. Of course, there still remain many open questions, and this session aims at offering the opportunity to address them together. For this reason, the last part will be dedicated to such a discussion. And now let's start with the first presentation. Drug repurposing, also called drug repositioning, drug redirecting, drug reprofiling, is the strategy to identify new uses for approved or investigational medicinal products that are outside the scope of the original indication. This means that new indications are sought both from already licensed drugs and from compounds that have failed for several different reasons. For example, because they didn't perform as expected in their primary indication, or because better medicines have emerged. Repurposing is no longer a new concept. It has gained a lot of interest from the community over the years. And why is that? Basically, for 3 main reasons. Repurposing holds the potential to bring new treatment options with no safety profiles and faster access to patients, to ensure affordable access to innovation, to complement traditional de novo drug discovery and development by mitigating high cost and associated risk of failure. De novo drug discovery and development is a complex process. It takes an average of 10–17 years and comprises several different macrophases, ranging from basic research to in vitro and vivo experimentations, to clinical trials, and finally to drug registration. On the contrary, drug repurposing takes an average of 3–9 years, as it can bypass several processes by decreasing times and costs and reducing the risk of failure. Here, the 2 strategies are compared in terms of estimated cost, times, and risk of failure. Of particular interest in this regard are the figures relating to the success rate of FDA licensed drugs. Only 5 out of 5,000 compounds enter phase 1 clinical trials, and only 1 of them obtains FDA approval. If repurposing can play an important role in ensuring affordable access to new treatments in every type of disease, all the more important is the crucial role it can play in oncology, characterized by high drug costs, complex diseases, and unmet medical needs. Not by chance, as the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan identified repurposing as one of its strategic goals for the coming years. Well, how is repurposing done? In the last few years, it has evolved from an ad hoc process to systematic approaches to identify and select suitable candidates. Systematic approaches can be largely divided into those based on experimental screening and those whose screening is in silico. The latter applies sophisticated technologies in order to identify potential new drug disease associations. In silico computational model approaches can be broadly divided into molecular approaches which concentrate on the understanding drug activity and disease physiopathology and are often powered by larger scale molecular data, such as omic data, genomic, transcriptomic, proteomic, as well as data on drug targets and chemical structure. And real-world data approaches focusing on the identification of unknown and at times unexpected relations between drugs and diseases. Incidentally, the interrelation between the evolution of screening and therapeutic strategies in repurposing for cancer is worth mentioning. Over the years, advances in research and technologies have made it possible to move from a poor selective chemotherapy to target therapy and precision oncology. New techniques of molecular profiling are at the basis of precision oncology, and drug repurposing is at its heart. Multiple and diverse data sources have become available for repurposing activities. Drug-focused databases, disease-focused databases, as well as tools to link drugs with diseases are instrumental in molecular approaches. On the contrary, data from electronic medical records, from registries, from clinical trials, as well as patient-reported outcomes are at the basis of real-world data approaches. And this raises questions about the quality of this data and mostly about the need of developing methodologies to enable data pooling and sharing from these different data sources. Collecting real-world data in a standardized way may help inform the design of future clinical trials and generate hypotheses to be investigated. Wow, repurposing is a broad term. So to what does it apply? It covers 3 categories: approved off-patent drugs, on-patent drugs approved on the late stage of clinical development, failed drugs not on the market, such as shelf withdrawn or abandoned investigational medicines. The first drugs, the drugs of the first category, have well-known and documented safety profiles and are already accessible for preclinical studies as well as for clinical development. As for those falling into the other 2 categories, pharma companies hold the advantage in accessing any drug-related data. And this bias in their favor and makes them strategic, essential partners in an effort to systematically identify new indications. At this point, however, it needs to clarify that the identification of new indications is part of medicine's life cycle. A new indication can be authorized and thus brought on label via marketing authorization procedures. What does this mean, and why should the patients be interested in it? Bringing on label means that an independent and detailed assessment on safety efficacy in a specific indication has been conducted by a regulatory agency. And this benefits both patients and prescribers, as it ensures them that the scientific evidence is robust. Off-label is another option for new indications. Across almost all cancer types, many products are already commonly used off-label, especially for patients who have no alternative options. Off-label use means that patients receive a medicine without a clearly established benefit-risk ratio. And this entails significant safety, liability, and financial risks, both for patients and prescribers. The European regulatory framework for bringing new indications on label provides different routes depending on the type of the applicant, on the amount of data that can be extracted from published literature. For example, variation for or extension of indications are quite common in oncology and are typically rewarding for a company as this expands the patient population. It needs to underline that currently only the marketing authorization holder can apply for variations or extensions. And this means that the patient access to new treatments depends on the willingness of a pharma company to obtain authorization for a new indication. Another important aspect that needs to be taken into consideration is that of incentives available. For example, in Europe, in addition to the 10-year protection period granted for any new authorized product, there is one additional year for one or more new indication. The orphan medicinal product legislation then assures a 10-year market exclusivity period. So, what are the main barriers to repurposing? Several of the barriers, and they range from intellectual property to data access, from financial to regulatory issues. And this means that challenges related to different areas, from the discovery, from scientific issues to economic financial issues, such as business models. So who are the main players in drug repurposing? Of course, pharma companies, repurposing technology companies, academia, but also patient advocates, regulatory agencies, independent nonprofit research organizations, philanthropic organizations are all potential stakeholders in repurposing, even if with different core drivers. So the question is, could multi-stakeholder collaboration accelerate repurposing? And if so, which types of models of such collaboration would be feasible? Here, this table shows issues and possible solutions in the repurposing of drugs, medicines for cancers. Among them, there is encouraging stakeholder collaboration and coordination. In Europe, STAMP is the framework specifically to support specifically not-for-profit organizations in repurposing of drugs that are off-patent and out of regulatory incentives. A not-for-profit organization termed Champion is the subject that identifies and has an interest in a new indication with the aim of bringing it on label. STAMP supports collaborative multi-stakeholder initiatives, stimulated private and public collaborations. Well, why repurposing in sarcoma? Let's take a look at this short video.
So my daughter Chloe was 15 when she suddenly developed a pain in her leg. We were told at diagnosis, because the cancer had already spread into her lungs, that there was a 25% chance of the treatment working. It was using drugs that were 30 to 40 years old. These were hard, heavy chemotherapy drugs. We'd run out of all options.
Sarcomas are rare cancers that still have limited treatment options, if any at all. They are orphan diseases and financial orphans. The pharmaceutical strategy for Europe 2020 has highlighted that investments are not currently focusing on the unmet needs due to the absence of commercial interest or limitation of the science, adding that there are over 7,000 non-rare diseases, including rare cancers, of which 95% still have no treatment option. In conclusion, the questions that should remain with us are the following. Could repurposing make a difference for sarcoma patients by offering them fast and affordable access to new medicinal products? Could repurposing be both a chance and a strategy for patient-driven research? How could this strategy be accelerated by the patient's voice? Thank you for your attention.
Very good.
Thank you so much, Ornella, for setting the scene for us for the discussion. So this is really meant to be kind of a network roundtable discussion. And so we'll try our hand at this hybrid of having people in the room as well as our people online. But I think what we're going to do first is have the three presentations, Ornella's, and then now we will go on to introduce our guests. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. Pantziarka. He's the Program Director for Drug Repurposing at the Anticancer Fund. He is the coordinator of the Repurposing of Drugs in Oncology project. And by background and training, he is a data scientist, and he's bringing his expertise to the oncology arena. We also welcome Dr. Marco Schito. He is the Executive Director of Critical Path Institute, Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Arizona, and his background and training is in immunoparasitology, and he's brought his expertise to oncology and drug repurposing. So it's very, very early in the morning in Arizona, so we thank Dr. Schito for joining us, as well as Dr. Pantziarka, who is recovering from COVID. So we are so delighted that you were able to join us today, and we will begin now. Dr. Piazza.
Okay, shall I share my screen? Sorry, is it me next or Marco?
Ornella?
Marco
is
okay,
next.
that's what I thought. I wasn't sure whether they
There we
were
go.
going to put Pan on first, but I'll share my screen then, Pan.
Okay.
So you should be seeing my screen, the full screen, just to confirm. Perfect. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing the session. First of all, I think this is a great opportunity to engage with patients, with other stakeholders, hopefully, that are in the audience. But also, I think it's really telling that this is a type of conversation that we're going to embark on over the next hour or so, or with a variety of different feedback and input, especially from the audience. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to discuss about some of the work that we've been doing at the Critical Path Institute on drug repurposing, and thought I'd spend maybe just a few seconds about discussing about what the Critical Path Institute is. It's a nonprofit organization. We are based out of Tucson, Arizona, but we do have offices in Europe. We have an office in Dublin, Ireland, as well as Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And CPath, really what it does is bring together many of these stakeholders, many of those that were already discussed with Ornella's presentation, and includes patient groups from around the world, really to try to help and improve public health issues from a variety of different unmet health and clinical needs. And together we work collaboratively with regulators and identifying and creating and accelerating medical product development, and especially the regulatory process with not only FDA, but EMA as well. And how CPath works is that we're actually acting as a trusted neutral third party to improve public health and on the global level. We do so by forming public-private partnerships. Those partnerships convene with scientific consortia primarily with industry, academia, and government, but others as well, to really pull together a lot of the data that's needed. This is a data-driven science. We need to have data in order to make some of those decisions. And so we pull in the best science, the broadest experience, and we pull in active consensus building amongst the different stakeholders that we interact with. And from the regulatory perspective, we enable this iterative discussion between the participants as well as the regulators in developing new methods to assess the safety and efficacy of medical products so that we actually can have an official endorsement of those novel methodologies and drug development tools to meet those the unmet need that we're defining. So for the collaboratory that I lead, it was launched a couple of years ago. It's a public-private partnership as well. It's funded 100% by FDA. We work also very closely with NCATS, the National Centers for Advanced Translational Science at the National Institutes of Health. This was in June of 2020. And again, we're really here to bring stakeholders together to address how drug repurposing can be accelerated. Our mission is to become a global public source of validated real-world data to advance drug repurposing for the diseases of highest unmet medical need. We do this across infectious diseases, across different populations. We work with neonates, pregnant women, as well as rare diseases. And that's really where I'm here, why I'm here and talking today. And more so along the lines of generic drugs, especially since those are the type of drugs where there's a lack of interest from pharma because of a lack of commercial incentives, and also the issues with regulatory pathways that Ornella had indicated earlier. So based on the timing, June of 2020, what was going on in the world, global issue was COVID, and PAN unfortunately is still having to bear the brunt of that. But we decided to actually have a pilot study because at the time, basically anything that was used to treat COVID was off-label. And so we thought, can the systematic collection of that anecdotal data that people are generating on a daily basis for such a large disease regarding off-label prescriptions, could that be used to advance drug repurposing? And the intent here is formulating a hypothesis, and a hypothesis not for drug safety, but really for effectiveness that can be further assessed in randomized clinical trials. And we also thought that, by collecting this information and sharing it publicly, that it could be a resource for physicians where there's no approved product that currently exists for that new use. Fortunately, we were actually able to engage with FDA because a few months before that, close to the end of 2019, they launched a platform to capture the effectiveness of novel uses of existing treatments. This was actually recently relaunched a couple of weeks ago. It's called Cure ID. It's for infectious diseases. And what it does is captures and shares real-world experiences of physicians treating those diseases of patients with through a simple online case report form. So they contribute the type of information. The type of data that is being captured is through this case report form. It really requires maybe anywhere between 3 to 10 minutes to complete. We're really only looking and interested at 40 different, at the maximum, 40 different data variables that really look at, what is the disease? How was the diagnosis made? What was the treatment? Are there adverse events? And what are the outcomes of that treatment? Obviously, there may be some other variables such as comorbidities, a little bit of patient demographics that come into that. But essentially, we think less is more at this stage. We don't necessarily need to have the entire electronic health record to be able to make these types of decisions. But then we can share this more collaboratively and openly because we're not sharing personal identifiable information, but it allows then other physicians to come in and explore what other physicians have done in these similar situations. Oh, I have a patient that has done that I have that is like that. How did this physician treat that patient, and what was the outcome of that? So they can search by disease, they can view clinical trials, they can look up published cases, and they can review the submitted cases that other physicians have put in. So this is really a one-stop shop for physicians to come in where they can evaluate difficult to treat infections. Many of those are rare diseases, as we know, and then also have an ability to discuss those treatments with other physicians, so that you have an exchange of ideas and information by using this app. This is only for infectious disease, but we are now starting to develop one specifically for rare diseases. I think that probably by this time next year, we should have definitely something out there. In September, we intend to start working on an app specifically for rare diseases, but we also want to have one not only for clinicians, but also for patients. And this is the first time that we're going to actually explore the patient voice, and having a patient portal so that patients can actually come in there and say, well, these are my experiences. That was the clinician experience, but let me tell you about my experience and why that's important. Because I think that there's a lot that we can learn by listening to how patients, their experiences are throughout their journey. Currently, however, there's been fairly low uptake by the prescribers to actually submit cases. Most of the cases that are in this particular app are from the literature. So as a result, shortly after we initiated this collaboratory, we, including the FDA, applied to HHS, which is the Human Health Services Agency that houses the FDA and CDC, as well as NIH, to secure roughly about $8.3 million over the next few years in order to get cases specifically from electronic health records and also from disease registries on a global basis. And just high level, those deliverables include the expansion of this open access platform to include that type of data, the development of a tool that would automate the extraction of de-identified data elements from electronic health records and registries, and then standardize them to CureID so that we can aggregate and we can share. And then the procurement and synthesis of data, and this is obviously for COVID-19, of those patients from hundreds of sites, not only in the US, but also from around the world. And the intent of why I'm putting this up here is that although we're doing this for COVID-19, the intent here is to expand that to other diseases, and more importantly, the importance of rare diseases as well. So beyond this capturing that data, we are also taking a look at what that next step is. So if we can capture that data, that's one thing to find out what's going on, but how do we then confirm those hypotheses of defining what's been happening in these anecdotal reports? And so CDRC, we're actually partnering, and this effort is being led by Emory University, are pursuing two separate but related large adaptive platform randomized trials, again for COVID, but leveraging the investment that we're already making on electronic health record data extraction. And we have these two trials are an inpatient trial, leveraging electronic health records. And the second one is an outpatient trial, really looking at telemedicine and patient-reported outcomes. We're partnering with Medable to be able to do that. And we also have obviously some interest in exploring electronic health records for evaluating whether those patients would be eligible based on their background information. The focus here is in the evaluation of repurposed agents, leveraging the prior data on safety for repurposed drugs, the mechanisms of action that we already know and some that we may not, but also the reduced cost. And I think that that's really where the rubber hits the road, where the tripartite comes together. And the effect here is that we want to build a leave-in-place integrated infrastructure that, although we're using it for COVID-19, we want to use it beyond COVID-19. And again, the rare diseases, and in particular, sarcomas come into play. A second group that we've actually been partnering with more recently has been a group called ACT at Point of Care. That's a coalition that's spearheaded by Duke Margolis at the Duke University that aims to improve patient care and tries to address a number of unmet medical needs. And we're aligning quite well with their goals with what we're trying to do. And the three pillars are listed here, really the development of tools and resources to reduce the burden of participation of clinicians in community settings. Oftentimes, these types of trials are done in major institutions, and so you have limited availability for individuals in different parts of the country to actually come to a centralized area, centralized facility to do a clinical trial. So we're going to develop practical evidence in that we need broad participation by frontline clinical providers, not just those experts that are within those major institutions. And so the effort here is to increase health system participation to maximize the utility that we have there, and that we create an increased participation from these smaller, more diverse community healthcare providers, because that also diversifies the patient population that we need to have in clinical trials. There's a few features. I won't go through all of these. Obviously, there's some implementation and quality by design aspects of these trials that are useful. And but I do want to spend maybe a couple of seconds on the last 2 points. One being that the focus really is on the patients, especially for outpatients. We're looking at patient-reported outcomes as the primary measure. And that the outcomes that are captured in routine care for inpatients, rather than having a separate system and a completely different aspect of clinical trials, is by leveraging the current system that's already present to be able to capture that information. And we also want to maximize the value of that investment, that although we're using it for COVID-19, that as I mentioned before, we want to use it for other diseases as well. And the potential here is really to look at the quality of that data and improve the quality of that data to produce regulatory grade information that, although may be submitted, may not be also be submitted for regulatory approval. And the last part is really the regulatory impact. And we do have a working group called the Regulatory Legislative Policy Working Group that helps identify and define the barriers for drug repurposing. We help inform on the strategies and approaches to advance the repurposing of drugs. Many of these agencies and regulatory agencies that we have been working with and talking to have programs that are in place. Ornella just talked about STAMP and the EMA. FDA have a series of other initiatives that they're working on. And as we learn and talk with the MHRA and the NHS, the UK have their own series of repurposing initiatives moving forward, as does the TGA over in Australia. So there's a variety of different it's a unique opportunity to see what other regulatory agencies are doing and to be able to share that information more effectively. Because I think that we can, by sharing that information, help develop a blueprint on how to address those regulatory challenges for drug repurposing, and that we communicate this through a variety of different methods, including publications, to basically inform, educate, and collaborate with stakeholder communities at large. I try to put this type of slide above to really try to consolidate the last 10 minutes that I've been talking about to figure out, yeah, there are actually multiple stages that we have to go through. We have to prioritize the diseases. We have to generate the hypothesis from real world data, these incidental findings that are being generated on a daily basis. And then identifying how it is that we can, what's the level of evidence that would be needed to go from each one of these stages, from hypothesis generation to confirmation using clinical trials, to informing clinical practice, and then the regulatory aspect. So there's a framework that we're working through to be able to do that. But what I want to also emphasize is the patient impact, because although we're focusing, because we need to focus and our efforts on a few diseases, by the time we get into the guidelines, especially the policy and legislation, that will actually offer opportunity to be more disease agnostic, because the things that we learn for one disease may also be applied for other diseases in general. And the bottom part of this graph is really all the various different stakeholders that we engage with. And I've highlighted the patients, and it's not necessarily that patients need to be involved in every aspect of these different stages, but we do think that they are involved and play a very important role in a few different stages with regards to generating the hypothesis, the clinical trials, and then especially the policy and the potentially the legislation part of it as well. I do want to spend a couple of minutes on sarcoma in general. I've been working for the past several months with Denise. We've also been partnering with Dr. Bill Tapp at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to really pull together these stakeholder groups and start having some of these more general discussions. But Denise has been a tour de force. She's been my rock over the past several months because she's pulled together a drug repurposing task force to engage with a variety of different groups and of sarcoma subtype patients and patient advocates. And for my purpose, at least, and Denise may have her needs and rationales as well, but I really want to be able to engage patients to incorporate their voices in clinical trials, to explore these sort of app-based portals and how patients can provide information on their experiences and outcomes regarding their use of repurposed drugs. And then I think one of the other areas of that would be worthwhile exploring is interest in developing patient-reported outcomes, more effective ones, more tools to be able to utilize in clinical trials that are validated. I know that there are a number of issues that we need to address. For example, the patient portal is something that we'll want to be discussing with patient groups and patients alike. We're still defining some of these pilot projects within sarcoma and some of the sarcoma subtypes that we've been starting to align on. We can't do every sarcoma at the same time, so we've got to just be able to pick a few, some low-hanging fruits where we know that there is currently repurposing occurring, and so that data is already there. Not necessarily that these are the only things that we're going to be working on. But angiosarcoma, EHE, and PCOMA are the three that sort of raised fairly early to the top of the list. But I also want to spend just a slide or so on capturing what we need to capture, which a lot of it has to do with unstructured data from patient records, and to be able to share that information in a de-identified format. So the typical way that we've been doing this, and the way that I've spoke before, is to develop tools to implement in major cancer centers, right? So develop a tool, you implement it in a hospital system, and that they extract that data from their electronic health records. That it's going to require time. There's going to be some cost. There likely will be some bias to that, but it does build that infrastructure. Another way that we can do this alternatively would be to work directly with patients, perhaps, through partnership with companies such as XViewers, who have built an infrastructure to be able to extract data from patients and patient records. And many of those sort of unstructured data that we're talking about include the clinical notes, imaging, a lot of the pathology reports, and those are very difficult to capture from electronic health records. Not impossible, but difficult. And so in looking at their modeling right now, they're a US-based company, but it's something that we can look for in Europe as well, is that the patient is referred, they have an IRB, they have informed consent, so the patient consents to having this company directly access their medical records. That's pulled into their own database, which is a regulatory compliant database. The data is stored under CDISC standards, so it can be transferred directly to FDA if need be. But what the patient receives at this point, and this is all at no cost, is a personalized treatment option, access to mechanisms of treatments, participation in virtual tumor boards, access to expert insights in leading institutions, and really what they do is pull their electronic health records into a single file that then they can provide the patient. So it's their personalized health record for their disease. And they do this throughout their journey in cancer. And so this platform then could accelerate clinical research by capturing that regulatory grade outcomes from real world data that can be and then submitted to regulatory agencies like the FDA. And what this platform does is then they follow the patients in their standard of care as they're moving forward, as they're monitoring. But when a patient then has exhausted those standard of care treatment options, they are then, there's an AI-driven sort of algorithm that goes in the background and identifies patients for clinical trials. And those patients that are not identified by that can still opt in for using some of these types of drugs off-label. But the ability here is then to leverage the work that's currently being done to then being able to share that data in your platform, where you're sharing a limited amount of their data variables, all de-identified, making this publicly available as a case report form. And it really then summarizes the journey of the patient so that other clinicians can get a better idea and sense of how that drug may or may not have worked. So I think that this sort of can ask a number of questions to sarcoma patients. Is XCures a company that, or a model that patients would want to partner? Everything is free for the patients, but they do have to give up their data. The model is through biopharma, access to novel treatments, and funding comes from pharma. So that's the question: is that something that patients really want to do, or is it better to work directly with cancer centers where we know where the data arises, where it's currently held, and that this model is something that is better for patients or not. So again, I want to be completely transparent and clear to say that we've got a fork in the road. There's a couple of ways that we can do this. And I'd like to hear from patients over the course of the next several months of, the pros and cons and whether they like one versus the other, because we're going to eventually have to explore the best way to path forward for this. And so that's where I'd like to stop now, and hopefully we'll have a further discussion about the potential of which ways in which we can share that data. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Schito. I think that gives an excellent starting point for everyone to begin to think about some questions, engaging the patient voice early on. Here's a platform that was developed with funding from the environment of COVID, and how is this now going to be able to be leveraged to help us better understand opportunities within sarcoma. So think about your questions, and it's not like it's a done deal, right? So it's coming now, as Marcus was speaking about yesterday, bringing the patient voice in early. What do you think? What are your perspectives? So with that, I think we'll turn to Pan and then do questions and discussion after Pan's presentation. So thank you, Marco. And maybe we'll turn now to Pan.
Hi, just get my screen ready.
We see your screen well, thank you.
That's great, and I apologize in advance if I'm a bit croaky. Thank you, Denise and Ornella, for giving me this opportunity to address this meeting. It's really been really interesting seeing the presentation so far, and I hope I can add something of value to it too. Let me start by just mentioning who the Anticancer Fund are. We are a European not-for-profit organisation based in Brussels. I am based in London, and what we do, we focus on developing new cancer treatments for patients where there's no commercial interest. And obviously drug repurposing is one such area, but not the only one. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've learned in the process. We've been involved in repurposing for quite a number of years now. And one of the first questions that people ask is, where do we find our repurposing candidates? Now, Ornella mentioned that repurposing can include generic drugs, but also shelved compounds, drugs which were abandoned for commercial reasons. Our interest is really in existing licensed medicines. Most of those are generic, but not all of them. Sometimes we have some really good candidates which are still under patent protection, and they look like they have great potential. But there's a real difference in repurposing between those kinds of candidates where there is a financial interest in the organization developing them, and looking at a drug like metformin or aspirin or a very old generic drug where there are real obstacles in the way. So for us, we've adopted a literature-based approach. We look for repurposing candidates in the published literature, in case reports, in bioinformatic modeling, high throughput screening. Case reports are really important, lucky accidents, and I'll talk about some examples of these as we go ahead. So for us, there's no shortage of repurposing candidates. We publish a database, an open access database of non-cancer drugs which have got evidence of anti-cancer activity. And at the last update, we had 366 candidates, which is actually, if we were a pharma company and had 366 drugs in our pipeline, we would be laughing all the way to the bank. I mean, it's a very healthy list of drugs. There's human data to 72% of those, which is surprising to many people. At least 2/3 have had a clinical trial performed. Most of them, 86%, are off patent. A third are included in the World Health Organization list of essential medicines, which means that they are widely available and often very low cost. And in terms of validated molecular targets, there are almost 1,200 molecular targets listed. All of this is published online. And obviously our interest is in clinical trials. We want to get these treatments to patients. So in addition to having a database of candidate drugs, we also have a database of active clinical trials. So these are trials which are ongoing or about to kick off. So you can see there are currently 873 active clinical trials using some of these drug candidates in 43 countries, almost 170,000 patients included in these clinical trials. So for us, this is a really positive story. Drug repurposing for a long time was seen as kind of a niche thing in drug development, but actually in the last few years it has really expanded. And for us, the good news is that most of these candidates can be used as is. There's no need for reformulation or changing the doses. I mean, many of these drugs could be used as is in clinical trials to treat cancer patients. But of course, we talk about repurposing, but there's a huge difference in cases. And there's a spectrum of repurposing activity. And at one extreme, we have what we've termed soft repurposing, which is taking a drug from one cancer where it's used and using it to treat a different cancer. And that happens all the time in oncology. It's the standard practice. If you're a pharma company, you license a drug for cancer A, and then you look for cancer B, or you go from second line to first line. And so that's part of the normal process of drug development in oncology. What we call hard repurposing is the thing that we're specifically interested in, which is to take a non-cancer drug and use that as a cancer treatment. And that's a much harder ask. So there are actually very few concrete, widely used examples of hard repurposing. Probably the most well-known is thalidomide, which had a horrendous prehistory of causing birth defects and so on, but was later repurposed to treat other diseases, including becoming a standard treatment for multiple myeloma. Another example is all-trans-retinoic acid, which was used to treat acne, for example, and is now used to treat a form of leukemia, and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs used to treat desmoid tumors. But that's actually a very, very small list, given the number of repurposing candidates that exist. And so we have to ask, why is it such a hard thing to do to take these non-cancer drugs and use them to treat cancer? And based on our experience, we think there are 4 factors which make hard repurposing hard. The first one is funding. In Ornella's slide, she compared the costs of developing a repurposing candidate to a de novo drug. And at 300 million, it seems like a real bargain to develop a repurposed drug, but 300 million is still a huge amount of money. And you need funding to run the clinical trials. For many institutions, we find that running a clinical trial for a very, very expensive pharma drug is cheaper than running a trial using a generic drug. The pharma company will pay for the drug, they will pay patient premium for patients who are recruited, they will pay for all kinds of statistical and logistical support to run the trial. For many of the repurposing trials, which are academic-led usually, there are no such funds available, so it can become very expensive. So funding is a key issue that's an obstacle for furthering repurposing. And of course, I think it's really important for us to say that, the benefits of repurposing include potentially lower costs, but cost isn't the metric that we need to be focused on. For us, it's efficacy. We want treatments which are effective. If they're cheap, that's great, but effectiveness is the most important thing, and it's expensive to prove effectiveness. Licensing is an issue. Off-label prescribing can be ideal in some situations. There can be good reasons for going the off-label route. If it's an ultra-rare disease where all patients are treated in 1 or 2 centers and the clinicians in those centers are all agreed, and there's a lot of experience, that's great. But for many diseases, off-label is suboptimal. There are increased insurance liabilities, data collection to show that a drug works or doesn't work may not take place. We've seen that some drugs are disappearing from markets because they're no longer used in their original indications, which means that potential repurposing candidates may be disappearing before we even get a chance to assess them in clinical trials. So for us, a label extension is our preferred route, not because we're interested in commercially exploiting a new label. But a new label, the process of granting that label triggers a whole downstream cascade of things. Clinical guidelines will be updated, reimbursement assessment can take place, formularies are updated so that treating physicians can know what the correct dose is for the new indication and so on. So for us, this is definitely an important thing, that we want to be able to license the repurposed drugs in these new indications. Another issue that we're facing is excitement. The medicine is not immune to hype. So for those of us who have a long memory, if you go back to 2005 and you went to an oncology conference, the room would have been absolutely full to hear about the latest anti-angiogenic drugs and new targeted therapies. You go to a conference now and try and talk about anti-angiogenic drugs, and the room is empty because everybody's going and looking for checkpoint inhibitors. And unfortunately, what we find is that you know, hype plays a really big part in medicine, much as we would want it not to. Working with old drugs like aspirin and metformin and so on, it doesn't have the same kudos in terms of publications in top journals, the good conference slots, pharma company benefits, and so on. And that really is a sad state of affairs, but it's something that the patient voice can help towards, because if the patient voice is heard pushing for work in repurposing, we hope that we can counteract some of these issues. And then experience. This is another really key area. One of the reasons why soft repurposing, taking a cancer drug and using it in a new cancer, is relatively straightforward, is that the oncologists are used to dealing with these drugs already. They're used to handling the toxicity that comes from these treatments. They're used to the way that these drugs are applied. But when we're talking about non-cancer drugs being used to treat cancer patients and fitting these drugs into often complex protocols, then there's an issue. And when we look at the clinical trials that have been published, we often see that they're quite small trials. You know, many of these are positive trials, but they're small, they're underpowered. What we also see is that for many of these trials, the endpoint is the publication. Where you have a pharma company involved, what you have is momentum, so that a positive result is already used to gear up the next step in the process. But when we're dealing with small academic-led trials, there often isn't a second step. There's a trial, there's a publication, and then it's gone. And so for us, one of the key things that we have to do is not just attack pharma, but actually learn from pharma, because they can do things really well, and we shouldn't be ashamed to learn from how they do things, so that we can make our repurposing work much more effective. So let me switch now to talk about a concrete example, because I've talked about in very general terms. So propranolol is one of the first blockbuster drugs. It was developed in the 60s for angina and hypertension, and it's a drug that's still used by millions of patients every day. And it has, over the years, been repurposed many times. I mean, it's now used to stop migraines or reduce anxiety, heart arrhythmias, you know, many different uses. So this is a drug that has been around for decades, and yet we're still learning how it works and what it works on. And for us, you know, we're hoping that there are some future uses of this drug in cancer, including in the sarcoma. And as an example of how repurposing can work, let me look at a concrete example of infantile hemangioma, which is a commercial driven repurposing example. So hemangioma is a benign tumor occurs in young infants, and although it's benign, you can see it's quite distressing and can cause all kinds of symptoms. And in one case, a child was treated with propranolol to address one of the symptoms caused by the hemangioma. And to the surprise of everybody involved, the hemangioma regressed once the propranolol treatment started. This was a complete surprise. And the treating physicians used the same approach in other children with the same results. And they did something really incredibly important, which was to publish their cases. Other physicians all over the world took these cases and repeated them, which led to numerous clinical trials. The drug, obviously for a drug designed to treat angina, is not designed for children. So the drug was reformulated as a syrup so that it could be easily prescribed to children. And in 2014, propranolol, now called hemangiol as a syrup, was approved both by the FDA and the EMA. But in many parts of the world, physicians still treat children with infantile hemangioma using the adult drug. There's no change to the actual API. So how does that work for a rare cancer? Angiosarcoma is a rare soft tissue sarcoma. It's a rare sarcoma, and sarcomas themselves are rare. The standard treatment is high-dose chemotherapy, and there's a response rate of around 25%. So not a fantastic response rate to high-dose chemotherapy, with a median PFS of under 5 months and a median overall survival of less than 10 months. So a disease desperately in need of new treatment options. And as a rare disease, there have been trials using targeted agencies and anti-angiogenic drugs, but they've been quite disappointing. Based partly on the infantile hemangioma story, lots of people have been looking at propranolol as an anti-cancer agent. We did a review of this and put together all the evidence from different sources, and it's quite a convincing story. And so we have the same thing where physicians treating patients off-label and publish their cases showing that propranolol treatment helped regress very advanced angiosarcomas, which is a fantastic story for a drug that really only costs pennies. At the Anticancer Fund, we took the multiple case reports which have now been published all over the world, and we went to the EMA and we were granted orphan drug designation for soft tissue sarcoma, and we're continuing to support people and work with clinicians who are developing more clinical trials so that we can get that final evidence of effectiveness that's essential to get this drug approved for angiosarcoma. It's not the only example. An old drug called sirolimus or rapamycin has really good evidence has been effective in EHE and in coma. We've taken the data with this and worked with clinicians like Silvia Stacchiotti to take these to the European STAMP program as applications to get them assessed. We want to do the same thing in the UK for the NHS repurposing program too. So we want to take these examples where they exist and actually take them to the regulators now and get these implemented, because we think that having some really good concrete examples will really kickstart repurposing and turn it from something that's considered quite niche to something that's delivering standard treatments to patients. Excuse me. And finally, in terms of sarcomas, in our database of clinical trials, we had 873 active trials. Unfortunately, only 34 of those are in bone and soft tissue sarcomas. Most repurposing work is still focused on the big cancers. It's still in breast cancer, it's still in prostate cancer. So there's a lot more work we need to do in the sarcoma world to really get clinicians to understand that this is a valid way of looking for new treatments for populations that are desperately in need of new options. And again, you know, to finish, for us, the key thing that we have to do is build that evidence base, and we can do that through the real world data collection that Marco's talked about. We can do that through the clinical trials, and we can do that through the new pathways that regulators are putting in place. But all of these really, they need patient voices in there to kind of help direct and kind of focus where we're headed. So let me finish how we make progress. We need more and better trials. We do need more funding. It's a key thing is that we need clinical trials to prove efficacy. We've already seen examples of new pathways. We need to kind of continue to press for better access and new ways of getting stuff to clinical implementation. One thing that I'm interested in at the moment, if to get a label extension, you need to be a marketing authorization holder. You need to have a manufacturing license for a drug. Maybe it's time for us to start thinking about a public interest label extension where patient organizations and academics who aren't marketing authorization holders can actually go to the regulators and say, we think there's evidence here for a label change. In precision medicine, Ornella mentioned that actually precision medicine is about repurposing in its purest sense. You treat a patient with any drug that's going to target their tumor. Unfortunately, what we see is many precision medicine trials, their focus is only on cancer drugs. So they'll genotype a patient's tumor, but then only look for cancer drugs. There are thousands of molecular targets in the repurposing world. So we would encourage all precision medicine trials to look at drugs independent of where they come from. And we need to start collecting off-label usage data. Although it's not our ideal endpoint, it does happen. So we need to be learning from every patient who's treated. And, you know, the final thing, everybody needs to lobby for change. That's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pantziarka, for that really excellent kind of view of where things are at and give us a real world idea of some drug repurposing initiatives that are off and running. Now, I'm just going to go through a couple of slides very quickly because we talk a lot about the patient voice. And if we don't give you a chance to talk, I feel like we're not really living true to it. So as we think about the importance of the patient voice, and I think that Ornella, Marco, and Pan spoke to that, I want you to just think a little bit about, experience that you may have had within this field and what role did you have, what went well, what did not go well? Are there other areas that you think that patients could really be most helpful to moving this forward? And if you haven't specifically had experience with drug repurposing, from the perspective of sarcoma, rare cancers, do you think this is a valued approach? Why or why not? And what important perspectives of the patient advocate really need to be considered? Hopefully you hear clearly that in the beginning of this initiative, your view is valued. As Marco mentioned, part of the role that I've played in this initiative that has been started with CPATH and the FDA is to convene a patient task force. So bringing kind of a structure platform, the patient and patient advocates can come together and share their thoughts, be part of the conversation, be able to say, help us understand what this is, what you need, what you're doing, so that they can then give information. So we meet monthly by Zoom. We talked about registries, natural history, real world evidence, patient-reported outcomes, and it's really been the patients providing that information and priorities. And from this task force thus far, we've been able to review what initiatives, many groups, there are many groups within the US. Out of the 13 that we had invited to the table, all of them had either funded something, were a part of it, were very interested. We talked about where are the specific points that the patient voice will be most meaningful, and collectively they were able to provide recommendations and considerations from the patient perspective. So with that, maybe take down the slides and we'll open to discussion and hear your thoughts and comments. I know there were a few chats going on. Please go ahead.
Okay, we already did our own research regarding drug repurposing in the USA. It's not still published, so I can't go deeper into the details. Also because we have signed a confidential agreement with Dr. Charles Keller. Maybe you know him, okay. But finally, the result is that it's not working, at least for epithelial sarcoma. They have screened hundreds of drugs, and apparently it's a perfect cancer. So apparently there are no bugs for epithelial sarcoma. Nevertheless, I think that drugs, or at least there are emerging evidences that drugs can reshape the tumor microenvironment and maybe open a window for immunotherapy. So I would like to know if you are working in this field and your thoughts.
Can I answer this one? You're absolutely right. Many of the repurposing candidates are not directly cytotoxic. They're not going to work as monotherapies. They have all kinds of effects at the tissue level and on the microenvironment, as you say. And even a drug like propranolol looks like it may actually synergize with immune checkpoint inhibitor, for example. So for us, a key area in the future is that checkpoint inhibitors can be enormously effective, but for many patients, they either don't respond or the response doesn't last very long. There's evidence to suggest that NSAIDs and other drugs, including beta blockers, may turn effectively what are cold tumors into hot tumors as far as immune checkpoint inhibition is concerned, or they may extend the period of response. So, you know, I agree with you 100%. This is a very exciting area for us to focus on.
So I would just ask that when you speak from the audience, if you'd introduce yourself, because the people online don't necessarily know or can't see so easily. So thank you. You want to introduce yourself, please? Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Markus Wartenberg, I'm the chair of Sarcoma Patients Unit, but also running an organization in Germany, Sarcoma, the German Sarcoma Foundation. Maybe a question to our two experts to understand this a little bit better. You talked about label extension. We discussed this topic, I think now for the last 6-7 years. The main issue is we have seen smaller trials from a sarcoma community, very good trials with very good results, and patients put their lives on risk by taking part in these trials. And also the experts put a lot of energy in these trials, and this ended up with the situation that the companies didn't go for a label extension. So the question is, what are the main obstacles in this area? Is it about the high costs that prevent the companies for doing the label extension? Or is it the administrative burden from the regulators? Or is it both? Are there mixed questions, mixed issues? Or can't we prevent or support this kind of processes in doing some incentives for the companies, or maybe put some pressure on the companies? Because this is wasted energy, wasted time, wasted money. We have some drugs in place that could work for the patients. This is the easiest way in getting new drugs to the patients. So I would like to understand the process better, because I know we are discussing this on a European level for the last 6-7 years, but there is no solution. There is no willingness or no drive forward in discussing these issues.
So I can step in from a standpoint of the US perspective, because we recently had a conversation with the FDA, specifically in a sarcoma situation where where there looked to be response, the company did not have interest. The regulatory pathway was that the company had to come forward for a labeling. And they didn't have sufficient interest because it was a rare subtype, not enough, it was near end of patent, there was not going to be enough financial incentive for them to do it. And so there are other ways within the United States to try to do that. Like, so sometimes it can be covered if there's a compendia listing, like if it can get published, and then people can use it and insurance companies will pay. So that is one pathway. But as Pan, you pointed out that maybe we need to begin to lobby, and maybe you want to speak to that a little bit more, for kind of the patient-driven approval process versus only having the company that owns the drug be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is that the companies make commercial decisions, and when a label extension is not without cost, they have to apply, they have to pay for the application, they have to do pharmacovigilance. There's a package of work involved. What you find is that they have a commercial pathway in mind, and it may not include a rare cancer. In some cases, they've decided they just don't want to go in the sarcoma world at all. We don't have access to their thinking as to why they make these decisions. Sometimes it's to do with they're much more interested in a newer drug which is going to come on the market, so they don't want to license one of their older drugs, because then it will be competition to their newer drug when that arrives. So there are all kinds of factors involved, and it's one of the reasons why we are so interested in looking at alternatives. At the same time, there is coming out of the SPAEN process, there is the European Repurposing Observatory Group, which has had a first call for projects where people have been able to put applications in, and part of that process will be to try and put together companies and patient organizations. And there's a similar kind of process going on in the UK as well. So I think the regulators are aware of the situation and want to do something about it, but the law as it stands doesn't allow much room for maneuver.
And there have been some initiatives to extend patent or give vouchers, so I think regulators are beginning to see the issue and recognize that it's a concern. Sorrel, I see your hand is up.
Hi, good morning. I just had a more general question for Marco, really. You're speaking about the CureID platform and the kind of clinician reported data and the challenges around that, with kind of not too much incentive behind it and having such a disappointingly low uptake rate, and then comparing that with when we're getting patient reported data where the appetite and the enthusiasm for doing something and contributing is very high, but the data is, in lots of ways messier. And, I think there's a lot of distrust from the sort of more traditional clinical culture around patient-reported data. Just I suppose those are two small aspects of the picture, but just some comments on your perspective on where you see the role going forwards of patient versus clinician reported data, really, and whether there's anything we can do to help either of those areas move forwards.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. So there's more interest now from regulators, at least from the FDA. I haven't spoken too much with EMA, although I know that there is interest from EMA as well, to really hear more about the patients and to get their experiences. For the PROs, it's still for a clinical trial not going to be the primary outcome. I don't see that happening in the near future, but they are obviously interested in secondary and exploratory outcomes, and anything can be one of those. So but they are interested in hearing from patients more and more. They're wanting to have this patient portal to be able for patients to provide their feedback rather than just hearing from clinicians. I agree with you. Clinicians are really busy. They just don't have the time for this, although they have a lot of time to go onto Twitter and spend a lot of time on Twitter, but they can't spend 10 minutes on submitting a case report. That's a little bit annoying, but it is what it is. And so we've had to sort of pivot a little bit and say, okay, if that's not what's going to drive them, there's no incentive for them to do that, then let's go for the electronic health record route, which has its own series of challenges and issues that we're well aware of. But we think that if we capture enough information, that a lot of the noise potentially could drown out, number one. But secondly, if we have enough data and that if the result or the intent is large enough, if the what we're seeing is a large enough effect, then that we should still be able to pick it up. And again, it's not going to be for regulatory purposes, but it's going to essentially generate hypothesis to be able to say, now we have a signal that says we should be looking at this drug in a randomized clinical trial. And randomization in clinical trials is really what is the gold standard for regulators to be able to say, yes, this is going to be something that actually could move forward. There's still a lot of
Absolutely.
legal challenges, and I think I agree with Pam. It's the legislative part. We've approached FDA to say, what if we or other academics can come and provide some of this information and data? Could we explore a potential mechanism for a label change? And they just said, there's no legislative way for us to do that. There's no pathway. And so we need to be able to engage from a legislative perspective to say we need a new pathway, because the problem is that we have these drugs that have been out for 50 or 60 years And we have a mechanism that doesn't allow that. We're throwing out a lot of drugs that could be useful in the near future. I'll stop there because I know that there are other questions.
Yeah, please.
Can I just have one cheeky follow-up, if I may, Denise?
Sure, go ahead.
Really just to ask, what's the role of the patient advocacy organisations in all of this? What can we be doing?
So I think there are several opportunities. I think what Marco had just said, there's an opportunity to understand the situation and help from a patient voice say how important it is to have another pathway forward. I think in rare cancers, understanding the natural history, so that kind of the discussions we've had on the task force, for example, around the registries that many groups have put together. There's an incredible amount of resource already out there that if we could begin to pool some of the information, that would have some very valuable insight. I must say that the 21st Century Cures Act out of the United States, one component of it is that the patient voice must be brought to the table. So they are now saying, so now we see an initiative from the FDA, and I must say, even though they're not officially saying we would have patient-reported outcomes be a path for regulatory approval, I have heard people within the FDA say, in these rare cancers, this may be a possibility. So patients have to be engaged to help us understand, you know, what is the experience and what will be the priority importance. So is that helpful, Sorrel? Yeah. Annika, please.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So this is Annika Laakso from Finland. And I was thinking about the Cure ID as well, because I did a small questionnaire for our patients and a couple of years ago, and the problem is that patients want to get involved in the clinical trials, but none of the local, they had not been discussed about the trials with their doctors. There was none of them had like the situation so that their treating doctor was starting the discussion about clinical trials. So if they had discussed about clinical trials, that was that they started the discussion. So I know the patients are interested in attending the trials, but as the case, for example, in Finland and in many European countries, the problem is that the language barriers, we are not sharing one language. We cannot have informed consents in those tiny little languages for like big studies. So if you're translating all the papers for Finnish, for example, and you get 2 patients, it's nobody is doing it, and it's in like several European languages. And in Europe, it's also the data protection legislation that's so strict that we can't really share the data in applications in a way that you maybe can in USA. So I think that there is unmet need that patients do want to get involved in the trials, but they are not English speaking and they are in EU legislation.
The data regulations and such. Yeah, I saw some conversation go along, and I see, Roger, you have your hand up. Did you?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I did have a conversation in the chat with Marco about data, but it wasn't that I really wanted to bring up here. He raised the issue of the regulators, and I was delighted to see that the MHRA in the UK was noted on one of his slides. And I would just say that as a patient involved with the MHRA, I seem to be involved with everything that's been talked about this morning. There we are. He mentioned the FDA and the steps, also Denise mentioned the FDA and the steps it's taking to improve patient involvement. The MHRA is taking very similar steps. And one of the things it's consciously doing too is reaching out to develop guidance on patient involvement for the smaller pharma companies. The big international giants are probably moving down this direction quite fast now, in each of them individually. But the biotechs and the smaller, more exploratory companies have little or no experience. In fact, we've had contact through as patients through the MHRA with a company which has only 3 staff and yet has a drug in the development pathway. It's not a cancer drug in this particular instance, but that's just an example of how the regulators have to start looking at these issues.
Well, this has been, I can't believe that our time has already gone by so very quickly. I just want to end with, we had asked everyone to, if they would be willing to complete a survey that we sent out. And it really wasn't meant to be a test. So we're not testing what your knowledge is, but we're really trying to understand what the community of patients understand about drug repurposing, and that where are the gaps, so that Pan, Ornella, Marco, and I can begin to address some of this and help provide more effective ways to be engaging. And, because there's obviously much more than 15 minutes of time. This is really a deep and robust topic, and there are lots of different angles and issues that need to be addressed, and people have different skills and interests. So some people, there are many opportunities to be involved in an initiative like this. And so please, if you have not completed this survey, I think we will send it out again after the meeting, and hopefully we'll get some good insights to give us direction, because in a way, it's a way for you to also extend your patient voice. And so hear it that we're asking for your input, and we want to know, because it's not a voice, but it's the collective voice, and how do we bring that collective voice together. So I thank you, my partner Ornella, for excellent presentation and for working on this session together, for Marco for getting up very, very early in Arizona to be a part of this. You're wide awake, and for Pan, as you're recovering from your COVID, for being part of the discussion. It was really very meaningful to us, and we appreciate you all being here. Thank you. I believe now is coffee break time, and then we return at 11 o'clock for our next session on quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, and long-term survivorship. Thank you.